So before we begin, in listening to our last video, Colin, you had asked, how do we know that the tabernacle is a copy of the heavenly sanctuary? And I think I kind of gave your question rather short shrift. I think I mostly kind of said that because the author said so.
That was a good question.
Right, it was a good question. The basis for it is Exodus chapter 25, verse 9. It's actually two verses, Exodus chapter 25, verse 9 and verse 40. So in verse 8, the Lord says to Moses, "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. According to all that I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all of its furniture, so you shall make it." And then again and then there are the detailed instructions. And then in verse 40, he says, "And see that you make them after the pattern for them, which is being shown you on the mountain." So a pattern presupposes that multiple things are made from it. So the implication is that that pattern reflects something, some heavenly reality. And therefore the Moses is being ordered to make it according to the pattern that reflects also that heavenly reality. But it can't simply uh, reflect that heavenly reality with absolute fidelity, because God is not really present in the same sense that God is present in heaven. And so last week we discussed, for example, um, "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst." We discussed the smoke in the God Yahweh dwelling in the sanctuary in the form of the smoke, which the high priest himself creates or brings into the sanctuary through the censer. And so there's a recognition that God, in fact, can't be confined to the sanctuary, that God's glory fills the whole earth, and God doesn't actually dwell in the temple. So does that make sense, Colin?
Because the it talked about you talked about copies last time, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're talking about patterns.
Well, the pattern is used to create the copy
Of the tabernacle.
of the tabernacle, which is a shadow and a copy of the heavenly sanctuary. So there has to be a pattern, because the heavenly sanctuary, based on the pattern, doesn't yet exist, because in it Christ is high priest. Mm-hmm. And Christ has not yet been, or at the point of, or until Christ's death and resurrection, that full pattern of the sanctuary, heavenly sanctuary, has not yet been realized. There is no high priest. With that, let's read the first four verses of chapter 10, and maybe we'll finish all four verses tonight. That would be amazing progress. So chapter 10, verse 1. "For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices which are continually offered year after year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? If the worshippers had once been cleansed, they would no longer have any consciousness of sin. But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sin year after year. For it is impossible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. Now, how is this related to the previous sections? Our usual starting question.
Well, in the previous sections, they've talked about how the priests haven't been the same, the sacrifices haven't been the same. You know, comparing the old covenant with what's happened after Christ arrived. So his entry into human life and his sacrifice surpasses and fulfills all of the old covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of been what they've been talking about in the last several chapters.
Mm-hmm. And so he talked about the eternal high priest versus the priests who die, who receive their priesthood from heredity, as opposed to a priest who is himself appointed directly by God. He talks about sacrifices, or now he moves on to sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
In verse 8, chapter 8, verses 3 and 5, he says, "For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Hence, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Though if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law." So there's the place at which sacrifices are offered, the priest offering the sacrifice, and here he looks at the character of the sacrifice. He also picks up on the theme from the last chapter, near the end of the last chapter. But this is really a direct continuation of chapter 9, verses 23 to 26, which makes verses 27 through 27 and 28 really kind of an aside.
Mm-hmm.
So verses 23 through 26, thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. So the question becomes, what are better sacrifices? For Christ has entered not into a sanctuary made with hands, a copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest enters the holy place yearly with blood not his own, for then he would have to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the age, put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And then we have the aside,
Mm-hmm.
which is really an eschatological aside. Yeah, I think it's deliberate because he wants to emphasize his eschatology before returning to the main theme. So here the underlying issue is, why is Christ's sacrifice superior? There are any other?
Again, they compared the tent and the temple sacrifices, never fully solved the problem of human sin.
Mm-hmm.
Christ's sacrifice has.
Anything else? He also continues the theme of shadow and copy, although we'll look at it in a very interesting way. He says, for the law as but a shadow of the good things to come.
Mm-hmm.
So earlier he was talking about the tabernacle being a shadow and a copy. And now he's moved on to the law being a shadow and a copy. So remember, they're tightly coupled for a law or covenant corresponds to a particular form of worship, a particular liturgy, or a particular ritual. He also picks up on the theme of sacrifice itself, which appears and ends in verse 22 of chapter 9. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. Without shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And he also returns to the theme of perfecting the conscience of the worshiper. If worshipers had once been cleansed, they would no longer have any consciousness of sins. For since the law is but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities in verse 1, can never by the same sacrifices, which are continually offered year after year, make perfect those who draw near. Perfection has been a repeated theme of the author. What is perfection?
Would be being worthy of the heavenly kingdom, instead of just repeat every year, that there would be a once and for all. So
what is the heavenly kingdom?
Sinless. What's that?
What is the heavenly kingdom?
That is perfection.
In God's presence.
Yeah, right.
Right.
It would be worthy of God's presence. Yeah. Thank you, Mary.
The ability to draw close to God.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what he means by perfection. So the point here is that this is really closely integrated and draws on a whole number of themes that have concerned the author throughout. So it's really the weaving together of an extremely brilliant theological argument. So then he has, since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices which are continually offered year after year, make perfect those who draw near. We have shadow, we have good things to come, and then we have the true form of these realities, which is probably roughly equivalent to the good things to come. So for shadow, he uses the Greek word skia, which means something that's imperfect or incomplete, or that points forward to something. So the function of the law is to point forward to that which is complete. So it's a shadow and not the true form of a reality. But then the sort of interesting thing is that for the true form, what's translated as true form is the Greek word eikon, icon in English. And an icon isn't a true form, it's a copy.
Mhm.
So how do we explain that? So we have a shadow, we have a copy. What sense does this all make?
Are you asking what sense does the word icon make?
Yeah, or what sense does this contrast between shadow and icon, which is a copy, make? I mean, what is he saying here?
The word shadow is icon.
No, the word shadow is skia. The phrase translated as true form is icon. But an icon isn't actually a true form. An icon is a copy. So icons of Christ, icons of the saints, those aren't Christ or the saints. Those are just copies.
The hand of a scribe in there?
No, I don't think so. I mean, no, that's not one of the disputed
Okay.
uh, words or phrases. One explanation comes from Chrysostom, who sees the icon as an image and the shadow as the preliminary sketch of the image. So he says, for as in painting, so long as one only draws the outlines, it is a sort of shadow. But when one has added the bright paints and laid in colors, then it becomes an image. Something of this kind was also the law. So the shadow points forward to the image. But there's a second explanation, which comes from a 10th century father named Oikoumenius, who sees this as eschatological, which is probably the most accurate interpretation. So he sees truth, which is heavenly reality. He sees copy, which is the church age and the church. And he sees shadow, which is the old covenant, Mosaic law, and the tabernacle.
The icon is the church age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll read what he says in his interpretation. For inasmuch as it makes clear what are the true matters, for that is also the truth. So he's using truth as the heavenly reality. By comparing it with the shadow and the image, he first knows the things in the law as the shadow, and the second, our things, those of Christians, as an image. But the coming good things and the true substance, the things in the coming age, or the things in the coming age, or just as the image is not entirely in accord with the truth, so also the shadow is not entirely in accord with the image. Or even if the image does not have the very truth, except that it exists as a visible imitation of the truth by preserving the shape through its surfaces and the proportions of its members and the complexion of the substrate. But the shadow is an indistinct appearance of the image, showing none of the things of which it is the image. And so, going back to the end of chapter 9, where we seem to have this interruption or digression where he goes into eschatology, where he says, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly awaiting him, which is sort of a continuation of the end of the age in verse 26. He's doing that to emphasize eschatology and emphasize his eschatology in the middle of his letter. So is that all clear?
I think it's one of those concepts we'll return to again. And each time it'll be a little clearer.
Well, an image or icon, I look at it like the image of Christ is an image of God himself, correct? Isn't Christ, I mean, we see an image of God, of Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ and God are the same. So wouldn't that give us an insight of?
Well, Jesus Christ and God aren't exactly the same.
Well, they're not, but they give us an image of him. I'm not saying perfect, but it is a close to true form of a reality.
I wouldn't go to close to true form because God himself can't be depicted.
Well, Mary Haley, she got it wrong then. But that made sense to me
Yeah.
because we've never seen God, but we've seen Jesus Christ.
Well, yeah, I mean,
And if they're all one and the same,
that's true, but
can't I equal it out as being looking maybe
well,
not exactly the same, but
I mean,
kind of image of it?
I mean, so
Sorry.
Jesus, no, I mean, Jesus says that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't know that is especially intended to be understood literally.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
then we have the additional problem of um, depiction. So there is no you know original image of Jesus, and
Yeah.
Jesus has, as he's been depicted,
Or,
um,
or just
reflects
depiction.
depictions to
Yeah.
reflect,
Okay. Yeah, I get it. Okay.
and on top of that all, God is incomprehensible. So there are so the image, the icon, is itself also an approximation that points to a truth that does so, with greater fidelity than the shadow, which only in shadowy forms
Yeah.
points to the icon and then to the reality. Um, and then also, I mean, well, yeah, I mean, this applies, I think, so the copy or the icon is also intended to, inspire and help us to move beyond the icon or the image
Mhm.
to the greater reality of God.
Yeah.
So when we look at the cross, we, shouldn't just see a piece of wood with some guy hanging on.
Yeah.
We should, think of the sacrifice of Christ and what that means. When we look at images of Christ, we should, move beyond the simple image to contemplate the glory of God. So, um, so in that sense, the copies are also meant to move us beyond, or the icons, the copies, are also meant to move us beyond, the beyond themselves to something greater, which is God. Animal sacrifices can't make perfect those who draw near. Why is that?
The poor animal hadn't done anything. We're sacrificing something that couldn't agree to it, didn't have any part in it other than happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, looked a little too perfect. It had nothing to do with the sin.
But God
Mhm.
asked for the most perfect to be
Yeah.
sacrificed.
He asked for sacrifices.
Yeah. And then the real most perfect was Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
who was
Right,
sacrificed.
right. The perfection of the sacrificed victims points forward to the perfection of Jesus.
Mhm.
That's right.
Who can take away sins.
Mhm.
And can agree to it.
Right, and he did it willingly, of
Yeah.
his own free will, of his own accord. They're all offered repeatedly.
Mhm.
So if they were so effective in taking away sin, they wouldn't have to be offered repeatedly. And he says, if these worshipers had once been cleansed, they would no longer have any consciousness of sin. But in these sacrifices, so the but is a strong appositive. So it's a strong negation of the previous sentence. So instead of cleansing, they do the very opposite. It says, but in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sin year after year.
Mhm.
What does he mean by that? A reminder of sin year after year.
It hasn't gone away.
The sin hasn't.
Well, why would it be a reminder?
Because they're still guilty of it.
The sin was
But-
never removed.
But why not just, forget about being guilty and
Really.
pretend that the sacrifice is effective?
Right,
Well,
it burned the
also-
evidence.
It's also that God still remembers the sins.
And we're creatures of habit. We do things over and over again.
Anything else? Read the sentence again. There's a
Hmm.
word that can have great significance.
Mine says 10:3 is, but in those sacrifices, there is only a yearly remembrance of sins, the annual repetition of the Day of Atonement.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And
The-
these aren't
the
made
what-
perfect.
The what of sin, Leonie?
It says, but in those sacrifices, there is only a yearly remembrance of sin.
Uh-huh.
And it says the
Uh-huh.
annual repetition of the Day of Atonement.
That's it exactly.
It's blood which
There is an annual remembrance.
of atonement.
So what is remembrance?
Omnesis.
Anamnesis. Very good.
Oh, yeah.
So the Day of Atonement is an anamnesis. And so what does that mean? What is it that's being remembered?
Brings a past event into the present.
What is the past event that's brought into the present?
The Eucharist?
No.
Crucifixion.
No, past event.
Well, probably the
Present.
sacrifice from the year before.
No. Anamnesis points back to an event.
When they worship the false god, when Moses came down from the hill.
Yeah,
and he sinned
exactly.
against- Yeah.
Mm.
Anamnesis. What
Hey,
the
remember I said I gave that answer, okay?
Uh-huh.
That's the one I'll get.
Gold star.
It's the start of this year, and that's it.
That's good. That's good. Right. So the event being remembered is the golden calf. And so anamnesis means that that event is brought into the present and made real, and that those who are remembering are now participants in the event. So anamnesis is fundamentally a repetition of the golden calf.
Mhm.
This anamnesis has a non-liturgical and a liturgical meaning. We've been talking about the liturgical meaning, which is what the author means. The second meaning is it's really a request for action or for something to be done. So remember your sins and repent is, sort of an individual a use of the word of anamnesis in an individual context, calling on God to remember something which happens all the time in the Old Testament, uses anamnesis, but it's not that God forgets anything. It's calling, it's petitioning, it's in the context of petitioning God to do something, to bring salvation, to bring healing, to bring relief, to bring something. So that's the sort of individualistic context, but the liturgical context is that it brings the past event into the present, makes it real, makes us participants, and projects it forward. And so, given that remembrance, he's seeing, and almost certainly, and with good reason, he's seeing the Day of Atonement as an anamnesis of the golden calf. Do we want to look at the golden calf in Exodus?
Yeah, let's look at that again.
Chapter 32. The starting point of the problem is impatience and people wanting something now, which, of course, never happens to us.
Mhm.
Starting at verse 1. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold at their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a molten calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made for themselves a molten calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen these people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now, therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. But of you I will make a great nation.'" We can jump to Moses pleads on behalf of the Israelites, and God relents. We can jump to verse 15. And Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the two tables of the covenant in his hands, tables that were written on both sides. On the one side and on the other they were written. And the tables were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God graven upon the tables. When Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, "There is a noise of war in the camp." But he said, "It is not the sound of shouting for victory or the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear." And as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tables out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf which they had made and burnt it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it upon the ground, and made the sons of Israel drink it. And Moses said to Aaron, "What did this people do to you that you have brought a great sin upon them?" And Aaron said, "Let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, 'Make us gods who shall go before us.' As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And I said to them, "Let any who have gold take it off." So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and there came out this calf.
Not his fault.
Not his fault. It was the work of God that produced the calf as a representation of God. And of course, it ignores the fact that he built an altar to the calf, but not his fault. We can stop there. So Aaron, whose fault it was not, is the leader of the whole thing. It's his idea to make the calf in the first place. It's his idea to collect gold from everybody and mold it into something. Then, of course, the people want an image to worship. But Aaron is supposed to be the high priest.
Mhm.
He's supposed to be the leader in Moses' absence. And instead, he simply sins. And so remember, in the Day of Atonement, we have the sacrifice, a bull for the priest, a goat for the people. The bull is because of the golden calf. It's a reminder that the high priest, through their line, have sinned, and those sins have been enormous and continuing. So, for example, if we read Malachi, the message of Malachi is really directed to the priests to stop stealing and instead do your jobs. So you have the sacrifice of the bull and the goat. We have the entrance only of the high priest into the holy place, the only person who can, or into the Holy of Holies. So the only person who can go there, which emphasizes the separation of not only all of the people of Israel, all of the Israelites, but even the priesthood, other than the high priest, from God. And so the author of Hebrews earlier made that stress that in chapter 9, verses 7 and 8, when he said, "But into the second, that is, into the Holy of Holies, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the errors of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the sanctuary is not yet opened as long as the outer tent is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age." There's also the scapegoat, which is a constant reminder of sin. There's a day of solemn rest and fasting to atone for sin. And so this is really an anamnesis in the sense of a participation in the golden calf. So doesn't this contradict the Mosaic law?
Are you talking about the writing in Hebrews, or are you talking about the act of the golden calf?
The author's interpretation is a misunderstanding. So, for example, chapter 4, verse 35 of Leviticus, there's a description of the whole ritual, and verse 35, it says, "And all its fat he shall remove as the fat of the lamb is removed from the sacrifice of peace offerings, and the priest shall burn it on the altar upon the offerings by fire to the Lord. And the priest shall make atonement for him for the sin which he has committed, and he shall be forgiven."
In verse 1, it does mention that it says, if it is the anointed priest who sins, thus bringing guilt on the people, then let him offer the sin which he has committed, a young bull without blemish, to the Lord for a sin offering.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mention atonement there.
No, it just mentions the anointed priest.
Right, it just mentions the ritual.
Yeah.
Also, in verse 20, it mentions atonement in the context of the whole congregation of Israel. In verse 13, it says, "Thus he shall do with the bull as he did with the bull of the sin offering, so he shall do with this. The priest shall make atonement for them, and they shall be forgiven." So how do we reconcile that? There's atonement, and yet there's anamnesis and representation of the golden calf.
Well, someplace also it said that the children bear the sins of the adults, of their forefathers.
Others, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, although
And so I think that's referring to, that's what this is happening here too.
the basic reason that the children bear the sins of the fathers is that they commit the same sins. And particularly, you know, that those sins tend to be, I mean, sin tends to be cultural. You know, so we live in cultures in which we you know, particular sins are viewed as, well, let's say viewed as virtues. And so we feel free to continue to commit them. That's particularly true in terms of oppression. Those who oppress others see it as their right to do so. So that's, you know, a very serious sin, and it's one that's condoned by all cultures that are oppressive, which is to say, by all world cultures. And so there are two kind of issues here. One is that much of the atonement concerns individual atonement and sins committed by individuals. And the author, remember, isn't concerned with those particularly. And here he uses the phrase year to year twice in those 4 verses. The reason is that he's only focusing on the Day of Atonement, and the Day of Atonement concerns corporate sin and liturgy and ritual, right? So remember, his concern is not with individuals particularly, it's with the corporate people of God. And the second is that this is, by implication, only a provisional atonement. Your sins are covered only for a period. So in terms of the golden calf is a violation, the violation of covenant. The covenant has been broken. And so remember, we talked about that. It was really a critical issue. in when we were discussing whether the author is talking about testament or covenant, he's talking about, in those two verses, he's talking about a broken covenant. Covenant has been broken. There has to be a consequence for the breaking of the covenant. Consequence for the breaking of the covenant is death. So somebody has to die. But atonement offers the covenant to relationship to continue, at least temporarily, until the next atonement, or until there's some decisive event that satisfies the requirements of the covenant, that is, that there be someone put to death. With that, we're out of time. So next week we'll finish chapter 10 verses 1 through 4, which shouldn't take all that long, I don't think. Although, of course, who knows? And then we'll start chapter 10, verses 5 through 10.